This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Malick Hour, celebration of the life and work of American filmmaker Terrence Malick. Hello everybody and welcome to the Malick Hour. My name is John Bleasdale and I am delighted to be joined today by Robert Sinnerbrink, who is an academic and a writer whose work I've long admired on Terrence Malick. And indeed, I think we were just talking off mic, Robert, about how we first came to get to know each other, and we've sort of glanced off each other a few times academically, I think.
That's right. And again, as part of this, I guess you could call it Malickian community of fans and scholars and researchers and people who just love his cinema and have become captivated by it. I know I certainly have. And I guess over the years, you get to follow people's work and follow writing and research on Malick that's exciting and revealing. And certainly that's how I came across your work, John. And now with the amazing biography, that's really come to fruition.
How did you first get involved with Malick as a filmmaker? What was your first encounter with him?
Well, look, I mean, this goes back for me, I guess, to my student days. And, even though I studied a lot of things, actually medicine. First of all, that wasn't for me. Then I turned to the arts and humanities. I was very passionate and fascinated by film, as well as creative writing and things like that. And I remember a couple of moments that were kind of pivotal for me. One was in a film class, and I had a lecturer who, at the time, this was at the time when, let's say, in Australia, it was early 90s, I guess, postmodernism was, in its heyday. And there was a lot of talk about, irony and pastiche and popular culture being this, kind of amazing creative space, which of course it is. And there was this kind of whole line about, well, there are all these old-fashioned modernist dinosaurs, filmmakers, the sort of Goddards and Antonionis and whatnot, but they're kind of now superseded by this kind of very ironic, self-reflexive, postmodern kind of filmmaking. And I remember being in a class, and my lecturer at the time, Ross Gibson, a really wonderful Australian writer, historian, and critic, who was clearly frustrated with this kind of mood of the times. And he showed a couple of clips. One was from Badlands and one was from Tokyo Story. And his whole point here was just watch this. Just watch these scenes and just let it take over you. Just become absorbed. Just go with it. And don't try and think about it. Don't try and critique it. Don't try and say how ironic or here's the influences. Just experience it. And I remember watching these scenes from Badlands and just being stunned. I hadn't seen the film at the time as a student, and I was just completely blown away. And the other anecdote that comes to mind is when, again, student days, so we're talking about the late 90s, and when Thin Red Line was released, and I went to see it at a local cinema with a good friend of mine and a group of friends, and we walked out of the cinema, and I was kind of speechless. I was, from the opening sort of sequence, sort of underwater shots and the kids playing with the stones and the kind of swelling soundtrack. And I was just mesmerized, for the next 2 hours. Aesthetically powerful, so poetic, so philosophical, if you like. And yet my good friend, who I really respected and felt very sort of attuned with, hated the film, just couldn't stand it. And so I think those things together really made me, take Malick very seriously. And then from that point, I was just very much, wanting to watch all of his films and read stuff about his work. And, and that's probably been, well over, 25 or more years, probably going back a bit longer than that even. But yeah, that's kind of how I came to really appreciate Malick.
That's so interesting, and I think it's relevant to our conversation today as well. That there is this sort of temperamental response to Malick that people have, and he's one of these filmmakers that, for some reason, I don't feel any real need to defend. I mean, I'm quite happy to argue and explain and my own reaction and all the rest of it.
Yes.
I'm quite happy to articulate that, but I'm also quite understanding of people who just don't get it, who just don't
Absolutely.
plug into it, because it feels like it's hitting you on such a deeply emotional level. It's like trying to explain a joke to somebody, or try to, once, if you haven't got it at first,
or a poem or something like that.
Yeah, if it doesn't touch you immediately, then even if you get it fully explained, it's going to yeah, funny, It's not really, you're not laughing, you're not, that primary response is not there.
Absolutely. And I think it's striking, we were just talking before about Song to Song, and I watched the DVD again. They've got the interviews with the actors and producers. And again, I think it was Fassbender says something very, very similar to what you just pointed out. Malick's films do strike you at a very kind of, let's say, affective, emotional gut level. And you either go with that, it either affects you that way or it doesn't. Again, I have, many friends who, perfectly respect my passion for Malick, but don't care for his work, and that's absolutely fine. And, he, as we know, is this incredibly both respected and highly feted filmmaker, but also, I guess, very polarizing, and there are obviously very passionate Malick devotees who have stuck with him through thick and thin, because that's the other thing that happens. You have the devotees, and then you have the sort of skeptics and critics who really can't stomach his work. And then you also have this phenomenon, I think you've talked about this too, of the initial reception of his films, even Badlands, right? And I think everyone, if you're a film teacher, if you're a fan, you are into the history of American cinema, everyone recognizes this as a classic film, as one of the great films of the New Hollywood period, and so on, an absolute standout debut feature by this incredible talent. And yet, as we know, when the film came out, there were many prominent critics who just slammed it, and that set up a pattern that's consistently been repeated right throughout his career. Tree of Life, a film that I was just staggered by when I saw it and loved it. Couldn't quite fathom it or grasp it, but, was very drawn to it. And same pattern, it's since been recognised as, this extraordinary work, one of his best films and great film of the late 20th century. And yet at the time it was, highly feted on the one hand, but also just reviled. I remember having conversations with people who were just scathing of the film. And I suspect in large part because of the, religious or spiritual dimensions of it, among other things.
It links back to what you were saying as well about modern, postmodern sort of celebration of irony, celebration of this sort of self-awareness. And I don't want to over exaggerate in the other over exaggerate. I mean, an exaggeration is already over, isn't it? I don't want to go too far in the other direction by claiming that Malick is this sort of embodiment of sincerity. I think there's a lot of irony that is in there.
Yes.
But there is sincerity, and there is, when he says, why do we fight in wars? What is this war? Why are we fighting war? Yeah. It's not like it's a very direct and very straightforward question. And some people find that like insultingly naive. I don't know, people like me who and you who take that film seriously say no, it's not naive. That's the what else is the question?
Absolutely.
How else would you frame that question?
That's it.
Why do we fight this particular war? Or I mean, that's not
precisely. Yeah. No, I think that point of sincerity or conviction, however you want to put it, there is a real conviction there, and I know that this trope of naivety gets rolled out frequently in relation to Malick, and I think he's got. I mean, to my mind, he's got this fascinating way of dealing with, or finding a way of being both naive and knowing at the same time. It's a really fascinating kind of move. And I remember writing about this in relation to the New World, and taking on these very big but potentially risky narratives or myths or stories, so the encounter between the the British colonists and the Algonquin people, and this is a really fraught mythic tale that could go so terribly wrong, and especially today we're very conscious of these questions of coloniality and post-coloniality and so on. But he finds a way of dealing with mythology and getting to what's serious or profound or important, the heart of those myths, and kind of finding a way to open them up and in some ways make them new or make them speak to us again. And I think that's incredibly brave, and that's what I respect a lot about Malick. And it can be in relation to love, for example, talking about Song to Song and those more recent films, religious and spiritual belief, the most recent films, we're just talking about The Way of the Wind and when that's going to finally appear, as well as these bigger cosmic questions that you find, canvassed in films like Tree of Life, but also the familial and the domestic. As a filmmaker, and even people who are skeptical of some aspects of Malick, will acknowledge, let's say in Tree of Life, but man, that is one of the most amazing depictions of childhood experience that one can possibly see on screen. And I think that's true, and kind of memory and recollection and so on. So he has an ability to be direct and to be genuine, and serious about some of these big questions that can come across as naive in a way, like, what is this war at the heart of nature? Why do we fight and kill? What's this evil that overtakes people? Or what is love? And how is it possible in our world today, given the kind of culture and environment we're in, and the sort of beliefs people have? And at one level, that can strike some viewers, I think, as maybe uncomfortably naive or maybe corny or somehow spiritually like, yeah, that's getting too far into the religious. But I think that's what makes him a really brave and serious artist at the same time. And they're questions that really speak to us still in really important ways. And I think that point about conflict and war is all too present in our moment today globally. But I'd also say those questions of belief, Deleuze, the French philosopher, put it very well in relation to Simone. We need reasons to believe in this world. God knows there's enough reasons out there to be skeptical, even nihilistic about the world. So we need, through film, through art, some way of reconnecting. And I think that's where Malick is terribly important and terribly powerful as a filmmaker.
Yeah, it's easy to believe in life after death. It's believing in life before death, which is
that's
really
the challenge. Absolutely.
I mean, that's for me, and I've talked to several people who are huge admirers of Malick, and they share my atheism. I'm an atheist, and
yes.
I know, well, I don't want to name names, but I know there's lots of us out there who love Malick's work. Because I think just because you're an atheist doesn't mean you stop asking religious questions. And religious questions are questions of like, why am I here? What is the meaning of life? What is the purpose of life? Yeah. And it's not like you have to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's get to song because this will give us an opportunity to talk about these questions.
Absolutely. Yes.
In a sort of, so this comes as the final of sort of three loosely connected films. They're certainly connected in terms of the historical moment that suddenly Malick has gone from making a film every 5 years or 6 years to making a film almost every year, and he's making these back to back. Now, from my research, I found out a lot of this was to do with just was resources. That he suddenly had a lot of people signed on who had their windows closely attached. And initially, the idea was that for these two films specifically, Night of Cups and Song to Song, to be filmed through a single shooting period. Christian Bale was supposed to play the Michael Fassbender character, and so he would go straight from Night to Cups to Song. And in fact, some footage of Bale and Gosling exists, but was rendered in music when Christian Bale had to go off and shoot one of the Batman chapters. His window just closed up. This was also to do with Lubetsky being available, because obviously this is, at the time and probably even today, the most sought after cinematographer in Hollywood.
Certainly, yeah.
And he's making these kind of very small scale, low budget, quite tight shooting schedules. These films tend to be made in the editing room. A lot of film is shot, but they're shot. There's no setups, so they're shot practically continuously from sunrise till late at night.
Wow.
With the crew going from one location to another in the back of a van, or two vans, and them sort of jumping out and filming stuff. In this case, in the music festival. And even at one point when they go to Mexico, that was partly a solution for Malick and his team to shake up like what they felt was becoming a slightly routine. So let's go to Mexico. Let's just go to Mexico for a couple of days and shoot something there. My take on the film, through this research and through sort of looking at it, first of all, the film is kind of extraordinary in the sense that, unlike the other films in the so-called Weightless trilogy, which is, roughly speaking, To the Wonder, Knight of Cups, and Song to Song, both the earlier two are autobiographical, to the point that you could argue that Tree of Life, To the Wonder, and Knight of Cups is the real trilogy.
Yes, that does make sense. Yeah,
because that goes childhood, early manhood, first top period in the film industry, and then sort of the period of the gap, the Paris to Oklahoma. In life, it was Paris, Texas, but
yes,
in the film, it's Bartlett, which was his town of his sort of parents, where his parents went to live, and his early childhood before they moved to Texas. So Song to Song sits uncomfortably in that trilogy because it's not immediately apparent that there's really much autobiography in there. The only thing I could sort of, as a biographer, trying to pick something out, and I admit this is much looser than the other two, is that he was around the music industry. He did have a friend, Jacob Brackman, who was the main lyricist for Carly Simon. Terrence Malick himself had a relationship with Carly Simon, to the extent that the New York Times featured him as one of the possible candidates for the three men who are described in You're So Vain, Carly Simon's signature hit. Yeah, I'm giving you all the gossip now.
Now that is worth keeping in mind. Yes, that is fascinating.
And if you want to Google Terrence Malick and Carly Simon, you can find, or I might tweet it out, not tweet it, I'm not on Twitter anymore, but I might put it on social media later.
Yeah.
There is a photograph of an album cover of Carly Simon with Terrence Malick in the background, featured prominently. He's not just like one of a crowd. He's playing a character. So he is around the music industry. So he would be around it to the extent that he would see it. But he's certainly not around the Texas music industry. Yeah. And he's certainly not around the contemporary Texas music industry. In fact, I get the feeling that he was kind of using the film as a way of just going into it and getting his own VIP pass and having an explore. So from that sense, it's sort of a discontinuation. I'm gonna shut up in a second because I realize I'm going on a little bit more than usual. This film was absolutely disparaged on its release. It was the most pooped upon of all his, it got headlines like, what has happened to Terrence Malick, and Paul Schrader.
I remember those.
Yeah, Paul Schrader had a very unpleasant comment where he said, if you want to see what urine dribbling from an old man's dick looks like, watch Song to Song. And this is particularly vicious, given that Paul Schrader was Terrence Malick's classmate in the AFI. Yeah. So it takes on a tinge of the personal.
Along with Lynch, right?
Yeah, Lynch was in the second year, but they would have attended lectures together. They would have attended filmmakers talks together. And Malick certainly knew Lynch. They were both working on The Elephant Man from different sources at one point. So Song to Song was really barraged with this negativity by many people who saw it as one who saw the film as the latest in a stream of work that was you shouldn't use liquid metaphors after that Paul Schrader quote, a stream of work from Tree of Life on that was using very fluid camera work, very non-conventional editing and non-conventional narrative. I argue in the book that this is different from To the Wonder, and it is different from Nine of Cups. It is distinct, and it deserves to be seen as a standalone film.
Yeah,
it is, to my mind, actually more related to something like Jules et Jim, the Francois Truffaut film.
Okay.
In its narrative technique. And I think because of the way we look at Malick as this sort of like spiritual, voicey-overy sort of thing, we miss a lot. And I'm really interested. I really want you to come back at me on this, Robert. So we miss that the voiceovers aren't always voiceovers. They're often dialogue, which is just placed over scenes. We miss that this film is not sexually explicit while being all about erogenous zones and sexuality. Yes. We miss that this is a polyamorous film. We have bisexuality throughout the film. Ryan Gosling's character and Michael Fassbender's character, I feel, are more in love with each other than either of them are in love with
There's definitely an intriguing bromance that unfolds at a certain point in the film.
Absolutely. I mean, they dress in each other's clothes and they wrestle.
That's it. Yeah, there's a lot of that.
They wrestle in Mexico, which is practically a euphemism, I think. We have had a relationship, but we did once wrestle in Mexico. It's like, okay, you had a relationship. Then you did have a relationship. Rooney Mara, I always get her name mixed up. She has a lesbian relationship.
That's right. Yeah.
And yet nobody looks at this film as a queer film. The first
interesting. Yeah.
The first line of the film is, there was once a time in my life when I couldn't have sex that wasn't, it had to be violent.
Absolutely. And how different is that? Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, how different is that from all of the other Malick films? I mean, even if you think about the sort of voiceover in Badlands, which is a kind of a quasi-narrative type voiceover, or Days of Heaven. I mean, we're so used to, as you said, that whispery kind of somewhere between reflection, thought, meditation, commentary, all sorts of ways of reading those quite ambiguous voiceovers. But this is just a straight up narration. And I remember when I first saw the film, that opening sequence, I think it's this door opens briefly, you see Fassbender character, I think it was, behind the door, I can't remember. And then this kind of line that just kind of leaps out and kind of hits you really hard. It's like, wow, this is something different. So I think you're onto something important there that I agree has been skipped over, or is part of that just, you mentioned the critical reception just being so like unbearably negative about this film. And I remember feeling really quite distressed because I liked the film. I found it puzzling and intriguing and difficult, and I thought it was probably, and still think it's probably, one of his most difficult films in the sense of, you really have to let go of a lot of narrative expectations. We were talking just before recording about how this, Malick has this thing of casting these absolute Hollywood stars of the moment. You got Fassbender and Gosling and, Cate Blanchett and Rooney Mara, and just these absolutely stunning actors. And then they're kind of treated in a very unexpected way. Ben Affleck, right, in 2001, who barely says like 2 or 3 words, right, whole film, really played against expectations. So there's all sorts of ways in which these films are hard to go with, and I mean, there's more to be said there about why the critical reception was so negative. But I think because if it was so negative, as you say, one of the things people really miss is this is a film about love, about sexuality, about desire, about what people want out of romantic love, out of erotic love, and the very fluid nature of it, especially in this milieu of musicians, artists, the sort of Austin music scene and so on. It's got element that, and think back to Knight of Cups, there's sort of Fellini-esque elements in there, Antonioni-esque elements. To me, you mentioned Jules et Jim. I think that's a fantastic reference point for this film. I also thought of the Antonioni trilogy, the Eros is Sick trilogy, different time, different mood or vibe or Stimmung if you want. But, in a contemporary setting, it's sort of treating similar experiences and that emphasis on experience in that film, which is there from start to finish. That's something to sort of focus on. And clearly sexual experience, drug experience, musical or Dionysian type experiences are really central to that film. So, to me, what's fascinating is I do think there are these sort of, I thought of it as sort of very Kierkegaardian kind of reflections on different types of love and romantic love and different stages of, the aesthetic, the moral, religious and so on. But, that is not at all exclusive of sexual love. In fact, both for Plato and Kierkegaard, that's central. That's how you get there. It's through sexuality, through eros, through erotic love. That is the movement. That is what, drives us and drives us towards beauty, towards the good and the true and so on. It's sex. It's erotic love. And that, to me, is so central to this film. And it's almost as though there was this kind of dissonance, like, hang on, it's set in Austin, the music festival. It's not really about the musicians. It's about these other characters, but these characters are so wispy. Like, I described them in some writing I did on the film as personages. They're not characters. When you think of a character in a novel or in a movie, you're thinking of a psychologically defined, identifiable sort of fictional sort of person with these traits and this kind of motivation, this mindset, this, set of emotions or desires or goals or whatever. You don't get that. These are these fleeting kind of silhouettes almost that kind of bump together and kind of coalesce and then come apart, and then almost this sort of fluid brown emotion of bodies mingling and bumping off each other and trying to connect and not quite managing to do so, or doing so in all sorts of different configurations that only last very briefly and then come apart again. So it's that, I thought the description of these films is dealing with that kind of weightless idea, weightlessness or unbearable lightness of being, if you want Kundera's phrase. The phrase, I believe, was taken from a Virginia Woolf novel about this idea of a weightless existence, of desire, just glancing off things, and how can one live in that way, from kiss to kiss, song to song, etc. So, in the end, I think people maybe overlooked how central those aspects are to the film, and it is. There's a lot more physical kind of gesture and expression and erotic play going on in that film than dialogue. In fact, there's it would be worth sort of counting up how much dialogue there actually is in the film, but it's absolutely minimal, but there's an awful lot of sequences of bodies touching, glancing off each other, playing. There's an enormous amount of play, and you can think of that. It's partly erotic, it's partly artistic, it's creative, it's imaginative, it's physical. You mentioned the wrestling, dancing, and cavorting. I don't know.
Rolling on the floor. There's a lot of rolling on the floor and
rolling and tumbling. Rolling and tumbling, like the blues song, which recurs in numerous versions throughout the film.
There's lots of fingertips and there's lots of there's a wonderful scene. I watched it last night for the purposes of this podcast, and there's a wonderful moment where they're wearing sort of fluorescent fingertipped gloves, and it's going inside Faye's mouth, and it's just such a weirdly. It's like the film is trying, because there's no like conventional sex scenes, very which he's kind of done a little bit into The Wonder. There's sort of like nude scenes, and there's nudity, and there's something that you again is a surprising sort of first in that nobody seems to mention into The Wonder. Is like actually they get naked and they do. It's not quite as I've talking to Bill Abiri about that film, he was sort of like talking about, well, what about the bondage that's going on? There's sort of people are getting their hands tied, and in this, there's a sort of reference to auto asphyxiation with Faye wrapping a thing around her head. So there are kind of glancing references to this that you could miss if you're not. But that's how the whole film operates. It always operates on glancing. You know, at one point, Faye is fiddling with Cook's belt buckle, and then you cut, and she's kind of zipping up a dress, and the bed is obviously unmade, and it's you know, it's like Malick is trying to say, look, I don't want to give you the sex scene in the way you expect it. I want to, you know, this is the language which it's clear what has happened, and eroticism might actually exist in other places, not just the sex act. It's the old joke about Freud. If everything is about sex, what is sex about? You know. I want to go back to the thing you said about character, so we can maybe start putting together sort of the I don't know, laying down some breeze blocks, which, by the way, is what Malick called any sort of mechanical film element of you know, these are breeze blocks that he didn't want to have anything to do with, you know. Things like, you know, electricians setting up lighting and stuff like that. So the names of the characters are as follows, right? Because I think of them very much as Ryan Gosling, Michael Fassbender, and Rooney Mara.
I know, it's hard to think of their actual names.
So Ryan Gosling plays a songwriter called BV, and we never find out what BV stands for. But in a sense, just the fact that he is an abbreviation speaks to the fact that he exists as an ellipsis of sorts. Fassbender as Cook is a fairly straightforward sort of, he's the guy who's cooking everything. He's a guy who's using everybody as ingredients and creating, not necessarily himself. If he has any art, it is the art of sort of combination. Rooney Mara, her name seems transparent in that she's called Faye, which and she is. And she absolutely is, and that's her. You know, it's not a bug; it's a feature. She is someone who is her job is she has several jobs. She's like a dog walker, somebody who does inventories of like what look like high, you know, rich people's apartments, and also was a receptionist for Michael Fassbender's Cook.
That's it.
And is herself an aspiring songwriter, guitarist, musician. I don't know what.
So she's one of those slash kind of younger sort of types.
And I wonder if part of the problem people have with this is they're not sure how seriously to take any of the characters' ambitions. I mean, are we supposed to think Faye is a great artist who has something in play, you know? Is there something, because we never see her perform, we never hear her, we don't. Likewise, BV is similar to Christian Bale in Knight of Cups. We never, you know, we don't see any evidence of the art, we just see the suffering artist. So you know, we see him play more music than anybody else in the film, so he's more self-evidently artistic, you know, but it's still very light. It's still not.
It is,
you know, he doesn't come on stage and do a set.
He describes himself as a drifter. It's hard. He drifts, he floats, you know, he sort of moves from episode to episode. It is the ultimate sort of episodic type, almost a sort of collective stream of consciousness kind of novel. It's just little vignettes, little fragments of experience, and again that idea, that theme of experience. I wanted to experience everything, experience new things. You know, there's that scene with Rooney Mara with Faye in her apartment when she's talking about, I think it's the Rambo poster she has or image, and she's saying, look, he experienced everything. You know, he went to the limits. This sort of, you know, road. You know, the path to enlightenment is via the road of excess kind of idea. And so she's kind of very sort of fascinated by that, while being this incredibly, I love her as an actress. I think of her in Carol as well, this ability to be both very reserved and private and expressive, and yet have so much coming through in her gestures, her expressions and everything. I think she's absolutely brilliant. And she's great in this role. And again, I you know, it is hard to think of them as serious characters, because if it were a movie about literally the music scene in Austin, et cetera, then you would expect that so much more narrative machinery would be put into place to, Star is Born or A Star Never Quite Manages to Launch kind of narrative. But it doesn't really go down that track. I mean, I feel like this is all just the milieu, the kind of the world, the kind of context that's surrounding them and fascinating them and drawing them in, that they're part of, but they're sort of like floating in this milieu. And again, that idea or metaphor of this sort of floating weightlessness, ungrounded, fleeting. So that great scene when they're flying in Cook's private jet or whatever, and they're all literally, beyond gravity, beyond, good and evil, as it were, floating in this weightless, rootless, carefree, but, liberatory sort of way. But at the same time, there's that other side, which is, but you can't go anywhere with that weightlessness. It's something that can't, provide traction, or, as Wittgenstein said, sometimes you need that solid ground, that traction to get moving, to get anywhere. And I think that's kind of perhaps what some viewers might have found frustrating in the film, because it doesn't deliver the sort of struggling artist narrative who finally makes it or is broken by Hollywood or the music scene in Austin, whatever the case may be. Think of Lynch films about struggling actresses being broken by the evil, very masculine machinery of producers in Hollywood. I mean, that's a whole thing in Lynch. You don't get that here. You do get this very tightly bound up, but at the same time kind of fluid and morphing set of relationships, and it's actually quite complicated once you get into the film, because you've got Faye and BV, so Rooney Mara and Ryan Gosling. You've got then Faye and Fassbender, Cook. Cook then meets the Natalie Portman character, Rhonda, and that starts out as this sort of classic, almost dangerous liaisons type of scenario where he wants to take the innocent and corrupt her. You've got then the breakup between Ryan Gosling and Rooney Mara. She's then, at the same time, has been with Cook. Ryan Gosling meets the Cate Blanchett character, Amanda, and then gets warned off by his mum in this very Oedipal, very uncomfortable lunch scene that they have together.
I think that's really funny as well, because they sit next to each other and they're so obviously their hair is the same, and it's just like come on. I mean, she's got a point. You're basically going after your mother.
It's pretty uncomfortable. And BV, Ryan Gosling, even says to his mom at one point, "Yeah, come on, you're a stone fox, right?" Yeah. And obviously, you see them both sitting together, and it makes sense why the mother is so down on the otherwise just, magnificent Cate Blanchett character. So, you've got all of these dynamics going on. So, I mean, what's fascinating to me watching the film again is, it actually has a lot more narrative heft to it than I recall.
Yeah.
Because when I saw it and then wrote about it and watched, as one does, you watch these films again, looking for, clues or ways of making sense of what's going on or relating them to other films, as we were just doing. And yet, when I look back and watch the film again with some distance, it surprised me how, despite how elliptical, sort of fragmentary, episodic and kind of drifting this narrative is, that there's still quite a discernible and identifiable kind of set of trajectories, And in a funny way, it's hard to kind of get that when you're watching. I think it's because it's so poetic, and I mean that quite literally, so to speak. I mean, I think it is like a prose poem, if you like, narrative prose poem. So you do need to kind of go with it and return to it and try to enter into that space of meaning making. But it did surprise me that there is actually a lot more narrative structure and direction than I recall, and I remember writing to the effect that maybe one of the things that happened with this film was narrative. We all know, like, narrative involving characters doing things, having emotional responses to situations and acting and, and so on and so on, is how you sort of generate audience engagement and involvement and emotional involvement. And so you do need those kind of character hooks and those situational kind of dynamics to, engage you as a viewer. And when you strip away so much of those elements, the characters are more these sort of fleeting cipher-like personages. They're not fully fleshed out. They don't do a lot. They spend a lot of their time in this silent play or dance. You mentioned the sex scenes before, which I find really fascinating because there's quite a lot of pretty adult stuff going on, between the various characters. But it's choreographed. I kept thinking this is almost like choreographed sex scenes, almost like a dance, as though it were a musical.
I was wondering about that in terms of like if there was like intimacy guidance, because there are scenes where Cook sort of grabs Faye's crotch in a quite, very explicit, very, and just because she's sort of wearing trousers or whatever, you think, oh, well, that's not explicit. But in the setting of actually playing out that scene, that is very explicit. And that is very explicit from any non-cinematic idea of sex. That's a very intimate thing to do.
Oh, yes, absolutely, yeah. And yet it's done in this very choreographed way, like this. You have this kind of circling, dancing, almost sparring kind of set of movements prior to or constituting these scenes, and then they might end up sort of embracing or on top of each other or kind of engaging in some kind of erotic play. But, it is explicit in sometimes quite obvious ways, like there's some fetishistic stuff about feet and about heels and about boots and, all sorts of other stuff. You mentioned the, the asphyxiation and there's a whole lot of stuff embedded in there, but it's done in this sort of very fluid, dynamic, choreographed way. So it's I can't think of another filmmaker who approaches sex scenes in that way. And they're erotic play, erotic dynamics. It's foreplay as central play in a way. It's this strange way of evoking the erotic charge or mood without necessarily having to show that much. Yeah. So it is quite fascinating how it works.
There's a fluidity to it because I mean, I'm going to go back and then through what you've just said because I love the idea of when you talked about Faye and having the poster on her wall, and yet you don't really know it's her wall because everywhere she is could be part of her job. So she might just be noticing one of her clients. And the apartments that she is doing the inventories for, where she seems to meet BV for assignations or he's tagging along because he wants to be with her or whatever. They're all very much aloft. They're all very much in the sky. And there's even a bit where he throws toilet paper off the balcony.
That's right. Yes.
In again, what I see as a sort of a kind of joke in a way of look what else we can do up here, like childish stuff.
Yes, there is that sense of childish play. And
he dresses up and puts makeup on. And which again talks to fluidity, talks to gender roles not being rigidly ascribed or rigidly felt. I feel that BV emerges as very solidly as a character. He's the most playful. He's the one with the least to hide. Everything is on the surface. He's the most expressive. He's the one who's betrayed by both Faye as his lover and Cook as his manager who steals his property.
Yeah.
And he's being exploited and he's being wronged. And he's got also a family that he's left. So he's paying something of a price there, where he's left his father and he has to go back with one of the scenes, which I think kind of, I mean, it's strange to say in Song to Song, probably one of his least known films, but is almost the best acting I've seen Ryan Gosling ever do in terms of
that was amazing. That
emoting,
scene with father.
Absolutely, where he says, you've got food all over you. It's just a really
and
moving.
He's just broken. He's just torn up. But it's those little vignettes, those little moments that evoke. I mean, I've always thought of Malick as one of those filmmakers who specializes in mood, as opposed to just straight up emotion. So it's something that kind of suffuses the space, the atmosphere of the environment that the characters are swept up by and caught up in, and both express and kind of are attuned to in different ways. And it kind of goes beyond the individual, you know. So those scenes of the characters engaging in this erotic play, it's this sort of erotic atmosphere that's set up and that emanates and kind of fills the space, you know. And you can't ascribe it just to the one character. It's this interplay that emerges between the characters and, you know, and beyond them in a way. And yet you've got these incredibly powerful little moments. Like, that's one of them. And there's a few beautiful scenes as well with Rooney Mara and her family, you know. And this is the other thing too, because the scenes of this sort of, let's call it the experimentation, because that's the theme that you know, Faye, Rooney Mara, announces is she wanted to experiment, like, and experience things. And that is then contrasted with, and in a funny way, the Rooney Mara character, Faye, does have a similar kind of trajectory to the Ryan Gosling character, to BV. And of course, that's why they end up together. She says, I want that too. When you say you want to give all this up and have a quiet life, you know, so they're on the same page and undergo quite similar sorts of transformations through these experiences together. But there are beautiful scenes, quite poignant, with her relatives who have like children, and there's this sort of family setting, and she talks about kind of being torn up. Like, the part of me just rejected all of that. You know, I thought I was all this sort of goodness and
too cool for school.
Too cool for school, and like, I'm an artist, you know. And then she says something really poignant. And again, even though, you know, the film gets because there's not enough psychological depth, these characters are ciphers, there are these important moments where she will say things like, I realize that if I don't become an artist and I don't have this other life either, like my sister or whoever it was, you know, with the kids and just a regular life, I haven't got the artist's life and I haven't got a regular life. Who am I? What am I? What do I have? You know, so there's these moments of insight that do give you something to hold on to in terms of like emotional engagement, identification, and so on. So it is surprising, I think, when you kind of go with the film and try not to prejudge it too much, then I think these things become much more prominent, much more explicit.
It reminds me, there was a cartoon called The Critic. I'm not sure how long it ran for, but that's at some point one of the characters says, "Oh, everybody's got a family, you know. Everybody's embarrassed by their family," and another person goes, "Oh, I bet Sean Connery isn't." And then you cut to Sean Connery having dinner with his parents, and his mother going, "You know, when are you going to get married to that nice Mrs. Moneypenny?" And him going, "For God's sake, mother, it's only a bloody movie," you know. How many times do I have to tell you? And I think in relationship to this, BV and Faye have families, and they have to prove themselves, and they have unfinished business to deal with. But they also have the consolation of families, whereas. And Rhonda has a mother, and that's part of her seduction. And when she dies, the grief of her death is expressed through Holly Hunter's remarkable performance, but also the fact she almost gets hit by a car as she's walking along, and that's
absolutely, it was terrifying.
I think that's something we could talk about as well in terms of the city of Austin, the number of car parks and overpasses and underpasses, as well as, you know, musical bars that show music, mega churches, just a number of locations in this movie. Cook doesn't have a family. We don't know where he's from. That untethered nature that other people aspire to, he already has. And then he tries to tether himself to some degree, but ends up corrupting exactly what he wanted to achieve. And this goes a little bit back to the sex thing as well, because his endless appetite is obviously not conducive to any sort of monogamous relationship. And you have this remarkable scene, which a little bit reminded me of To the Wonder as well, and the scenes with Javier Bardem going into the community, where you have sort of what I take
Yes.
to be real life sex workers kind of just talking to camera
Telling
about,
this.
you know,
Yeah.
telling their stories and in a very
Yeah.
non-judgmental way, saying, you know, nobody's happy. I'm not
Yeah.
happy doing this. You know, this isn't where I want to be necessarily. But it's what you
Yeah.
do, what you have to do, you know?
Yeah, that is an extraordinary moment. Yeah, and I mean, it like there's a number of things there. I mean, the thing with Cook with Fassbender, who is fantastic in that role. He embodies this kind of restless energy and dynamism, this seductive charisma, this kind of quite you know charming but also dark and dangerous sort of dimension. And he's my gosh, I mean, this film is sort of pre-Me Too, but boy, you could really go to town with his character as a sort of arch exploiter of young women leaving this trail of broken and tragically in Faye's case, absolute victims,
Mm.
and tragic suicide essentially. Sorry, in Rhonda's case, I should say
Yeah.
my mistake. The Natalie Portman character. And one of the things that is interesting, one of the few bits of information that we get via Fassbender, I think, and some interviews, is that Malick had suggested read Milton's Paradise Lost and look at this character of Satan, this manipulator, seducer who wants to go beyond good and evil, so to speak, and create his own moral or amoral order, make himself a god, and there are a number of moments in those scenes when they're dipping mushrooms and honey and about to kind of go on their trips, where he talks, this is dipped in God, this is and a number of Miltonian kind of moments where she says you're so proud. No, people are not proud enough. There's this kind of dimension of wanting to go beyond
And having sushi off naked women as well.
Yeah,
You
that's
know,
it. That's it. And it's part of that sort of Hollywood or Austin Babylon, I suppose, the music world, the art scene, kind of art world sort of excess. So it's got that dimension, which riffs a little bit off those amazing scenes in Knight of Cups. The sort of the mansions and the Hollywood parties, and this again sort of almost Fellini-esque style, American style Fellini-esque kind of excess. So it sort of riffs off that a little bit, but he is fascinating because he seems to be utterly without a past or even a future. There's this utter eternal present that he lives in. That's and interestingly, even he starts to experience this kind of emptiness of repetition of desire, like almost like a craving for more. It's like an addiction compulsion where we need the next hit and the even more extreme kind of scenario and the next kind of excess to satisfy oneself. But of course, then it ends up being kind of less than was desired, and so we need an even stronger hit. So he seems to be on this self-destructive path, and it is. I find the Natalie Portman story, the Rhonda story, really just so tragic, so just awful. How how destroyed she is by this whole experience. As she even says, literally, I'm so smashed by this, I'm so destroyed by this, to a mother. So there is that sort of dimension that the film does push into with some of those characters and storylines.
I'm very, I think it's also going back to what we were talking about earlier about the voiceover, is that there's so much of the narrative is laid out in the voiceover where characters will say, you will hear Faye say, he got jealous before you see anything of that. And the voiceover very much sets up what's about to happen. I think this goes back to, I'm really interested in the fact that there was this 20-year gap, and then Malick came back to making films, and he really came back to making films as if the last film he watched was Breathless by Godard, or and the intervening years just hadn't really happened, and he was still back in Harvard watching the Nouvelle Vague for the first time, because those scenes of BV and Faye in the hotel, in the apartment, reminds me of Gene Seberg and Jean-Paul
Yes,
Belmondo just nattering away and
that's it. Yeah,
just having a relationship, sort of doing what couples do, which is just goof around with each other.
yeah. Play. Yeah.
Precisely what you were saying earlier. Another film that this reminds me of, and I think this, I'm not the first. I think somebody else. I've stolen this from somebody else. I'm sure that. I think it was Martin Wesner in his book An Examined
Oh, yeah.
Life.
Yes.
He refers to this film as a sort of reverse Five Easy Pieces, where you have. Whereas Five Easy Pieces, it's a man, Jack Nicholson, working in a
Yes.
drilling with a drilling rig,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
going back to his father, and you've learned that he's actually a very talented musician and all the rest of it. In this, he's a very talented musician, and then he at the end goes to work as on a drilling rig, and is kind of reclaims an ordinary life as something to achieve, to aspire to, rather than to settle for. I'm never quite sure if that ending, because the weird thing is, like, because the chronology is so mixed up, or not
It is
mixed
hard to.
up,
Yeah.
but there is a location in Texas called Enchanted Rock.
Is that where you see them in? Well, actually, there are a couple of little proleptic moments early on in the film. I noticed that you see that same location, that wonderful rocky kind of outcrop with the sunset and the little puddles and this beautiful golden light, magic hour light, which of course is then where they have their final embrace and so on, and she says this, only this, just this. And that's pretty much the last line in the film. So is that the location that you're referring to?
Absolutely, yeah. And Enchanted Rock is like a very high, it's the highest in the area, the highest altitude place in that area for hundreds of miles. So you get this wonderful panorama, this wonderful flat view of Texas surrounding you. And it's about an hour and a half. I've been there, drove out there one day, and when it was incredibly hot, and decided to go up to the top. And I actually didn't realize it was a location. Somebody who was suggested I just go out there for have you been here yet? Have you been there yet? While I was in the neighborhood. So I drove out there, wonderful national park area, and
Brilliant.
guided walks and whatnot. And it's beautiful area. You can. It's not very crowded, so you can easily imagine that's where lovers would go. So yeah, I think that's where they fall in love, and that's the ending is a callback to them falling in love, and that hence the ambiguity of, are they remembering a love that has been lost, or are they rekindling a love back to its purest form?
No, I mean, it's true. It is, because of the nature of the film, that the storytelling is so elliptical, and we do jump around different episodes, different periods, because of course there's so much fluidity, as we said, there's so much coupling and uncoupling and then reconfiguration of these couples, and not just couples throughout the narrative, that it is hard, certainly while you're watching the film, to get a sense of the chronology. I mean, I did take that, though, ultimately the trajectory where BV, and I do think in the end it's like Faye's story, or Faye and BV's story ultimately, that carries the whole film. And that in the end, I think there is this sense of, they've kind of been through this kind of experience together in the music scene, but it was impossible for them to love each other, to fall in love, to genuinely form a couple in that milieu. And, and the art side, the music side, which is supposed to be part of why they're there, or wanting to get that break and create, and they're surrounded by these creative people, and there are those wonderful, or at least one wonderful mentor or guide kind of figure, almost angelic kind of figure, which is the Patti Smith character herself, who does become a bit of a guide, a kind of a confidant, a mother figure, almost like a guardian angel, or a spiritual kind of rock, spiritual goddess kind of guide for Faye, talks to her about BV and says, look, that's your guy. Yeah. go get him. Don't let him go. He's a good guy.
And talks about her
And
own
so,
husband in that. She turns
and
up a
that's
little
really
bit like
poignant.
Christopher in Knight of Cups, who is played
Yes,
by the writer Peter Matheson, the author of Snow
right.
Leopard. They
Ah,
both have that similar real life figures, real
yes.
life
Mm,
gurus to some degree. Because
yes, yes,
nowadays people know Patti Smith not just as obviously the rock icon she deservedly is, but as the author
yes.
of Just Kids, the book that she wrote about her friendship with Robert
Right.
Mapplethorpe. So,
Absolutely,
she's an
yes.
expert on devotion. She's an expert on love.
Yes. No, that's a beautiful observation, and that wonderful sequence where the citing of those Blakean lines, my Blakean year, I can't remember the exact title of the song that she's performing, which then the Rooney Mara character Faye recites on top of the performing of the song that we see in the background is very profound, is very powerful, and I do think that's kind of a testimony for where Faye ends up. And the music, it's almost as though they were, we were talking before about naivety and creativity and so on, and there's a beautiful naivety and authenticity about them as artists, as musicians. We don't see them do a lot. We see Faye performing a bit on stage at one point, and apparently she did get up there in certain sequences, and as part of the festival was out there playing. And of course, Ryan Gosling can play and sing. We know that, and you see him wandering around, either on the piano. And I think one of the compositions might have actually been his. It was given credit to him.
Yeah, he has
Lay your
got his
burden
own
with the Lord,
band.
kind of thing. Yeah, so
He-
he's the real deal. He's a muso, so that carries he carried that off beautifully. But you get the sense that in the end, whatever happens with their music, they've managed to sort of transcend that sphere. And I do think it is a kind of almost like a cautionary tale. There's an element of morality fable or play to it, I think, given the way Cook is presented as this sort of Miltonian kind of villain, manipulating people and even destroying them, and that's clear with the tragic death of Rhonda. That there's something corrupting about the way art is sort of taken up into these commercial and industrial and sort of manipulated institutional and other settings. That again makes me think of Malick in a way. I'm sort of struck by the way that here it's dealing with the music scene. I'm sorry, makes me think of Lynch, I should say, when Lynch, in his later work, did make films which are all about the film industry in Hollywood as having this potentially corrupting force to it, and that they literally destroyed, particularly women, particularly female performers. Think of Inland Empire and so on. So there's something quite important there, I think, going on with this film. We could perhaps draw a parallel with some of the late Lynch films about what's happened to, or what the possibilities are for art, creativity, music, and film in our world. And they're both, of course, very much set in the American context, Texas, Hollywood. But I do think, the danger, particularly for female artists, that's a really strong theme. And there's no doubt that, you have the feeling that Faye manages to escape what potentially could have been an awful fate, as happened with Rhonda, for example. And yeah, with BV, I think in the end, it just wasn't for him. He was too easily kind of trusting and just got well and truly manipulated and shafted by Cook, with the rights to his music and so on. And you just felt like the guy was always going to be taken advantage of, and perhaps was better off out of there. So yeah, I do feel like there's a kind of arc in the end for all the sort of elliptical and fragmentary kind of narrative style that does bring you to this formation of the couple, I guess.
One of the things that interested me when I talked to the editors of this film, that they would come back and they would, and it refers as well to something that Valerie Pachner said when I was talking to her about Hidden Life. There was a scene in A Hidden Life where she was pregnant and she had to wear a pregnant belly, and Malick hated it because it was fake, and
Right.
there was no way they could do it that wasn't fake for obvious reasons. You can't impregnate your actors, and And so he ended up just cutting those shots and just like, I can't do them. And when I talked to the editors of Song to Song, they said they really, really struggled with the Rhonda's death because they couldn't, it just stuck out like a moment of melodrama. And this whole film is a melodrama, in the very literal sense of the word. It's a drama set to music.
That's it, yeah.
And when Rhonda dies, they use this phrase. I think it was Keith Frass who said this. He said it was a moment that you couldn't help but see the acting because she wasn't dead, Whereas everything else you could see, you could go with it. Ryan Gosling looks genuinely upset. Holly Hunter looks genuinely upset. They look like they're genuinely having fun. This is a moment of genuine surprise. Kate Blanchett, when she breaks her string of pearls and is, looks genuinely discombobulated and distressed. Yeah, exactly. But Rhonda lying in the water is Natalie Portman playing possum, And it just struck me as that layer of artificiality that they that their methodology of filming the film almost felt like they were cheating with it.
There is this thing about deaths in Malick, which is, I think, in itself a really fascinating kind of question because they feature prominently in all sorts of films. Think of Thin Red Line and
Richard Gere in Days of Heaven.
Absolutely, and the spectre of suicide is, and as you have talked about, the biographical dimension there is very important for Malick with his brother, the guitarist. I do wonder if there's some significance in naming the Ryan Gosling character BV, because wasn't the younger brother in Tree of Life known as RV or something like that?
Yes,
and there's some reference to Malick's own, the tragic story in Malick's own family with his brother, the promising guitarist who, I believe, trained with Segovia in Spain, who was really a wonderful guitar prodigy who died tragically. There is this serious meditation on and concern with death, but how to depict it? I mean, it's almost in the same way that sex, for me, in Malick is depicted in this poetic, choreographed, dance-like, sort of physically transformative and mood-like, erotically charged way, but not directly. It's like death is presented like sex in Malick, in this poetic, evocative, or indirect, almost symbolic way. Think of, and how ambiguous those scenes are. So, when the Pocahontas character dies in New World, and there's this dancing and cavorting, or even the very ambiguous end of the Olga Kurylenko character in To the Wonder. Has she died? Is there a suicide implied? Is it just she's, dead to him? It's very ambiguous. I feel like that with Malick, the depiction of death as a mystery, which, I think, like sex, he talked, there's a voiceover where I think it's Faye talks about, we played with sex, the flame of life. There is this sense of mystery and magic and fascination, but, mystery attached to sex, but also death. And so it's almost like it too has to be rendered in this indirect or symbolic or somehow mythic way. So I feel like there are these mythic ways that death is rendered, and that's potentially, as you say, it's a kind of risky, potentially jarring shift in register, because we've had this sort of almost quasi-documentary kind of feel and a kind of a level of realism. And you mentioned Nouvelle Vague. I think that's bang on. It's so attuned to that, capturing the contingent and the energy and the spontaneity of life, of characters in a milieu, in a world. And the film does that so powerfully, so evocatively. And yet you have this moment which does seem to be much more symbolic, indirect, mythical almost. And you wonder as if you're, so is she dead? Yeah, oh no, I think she's dead. And that does seem to sort of clash, or at least be in some kind of tension with what feels very much like a sort of a realism and authenticity. And again, that beautiful blend of realism and poeticism that Malick's and Lubezki's style manages to forge, which is really extraordinary. But I think death is a challenge, and most of the deaths in Malick do have that indirect or symbolic or ethereal quality to them, that something of the mystery of it, the ungraspability, unfathomability of it, with some potential, maybe spiritual dimension in there as well. So I do wonder if that's somehow coming into play here as well, because you don't get gritty, realist depictions of death, even in the war film, or even in, think of the extraordinary conclusion of Hidden Life as well, stunning. But there is a gravity to death, but there's also this sense of lightness and, well, if you like, afterlife, spiritual life, whatever's beyond. And there's that interplay that goes on, hence the dancing and the sort of choreography that seems to go with it as well.
Also, the fact that Rhonda dies in an infinity pool. Its edge sort of drops off and off we go.
Yeah.
And we see her mother, played by Holly Hunter, grieving before we see her die. And we hear her voice after she's supposedly dead. And so there's a sense of that's a moment of transcendence. And it kind of floors Cook, which is something... and kind of takes him out of the picture. That's kind of, he's done after that. We don't really see him much more.
It seems to have destroyed him, or at least neutralized him in a way that nothing else previous to that had.
Yeah. And I mean, later, as the picture progresses, and as we we get more of a sense of sort of there's something that Malick does here that I think is very pertinent to your mentioning of Lynch earlier. So Lynch has this way, especially in say Twin Peaks, but also his other films, is he films these kind of limbic spaces of like roads, empty roads, and you know, a building out of context in the middle of nowhere, and it's these sort of places where who is witnessing this, that there is a camera witnessing this, who are we, where are we? And Malick does this, he films a sort of like a foggy road, which with a factory to the right, or a building in dusk with a green lamp outside, or a petrol station or gas station. Sorry to use the American, and you just get these sort of. Or they would be still if they weren't moving pictures, if you like, and it's an odd sort of like. I don't know. It's sort of like this is becoming. There's this behind all this frenetic activity and this rolling and tumbling. There is this stationary. You know, when the traffic's died down, there is this stationary country that exists, and somehow you've got to come to terms with that in order to really make sense of your motion. I mean, it goes back to relativity and Einstein. When we're falling in the plane, we only appear to be weightless. In fact, we're hurtling towards the Earth at great speed. And the plane doing that relative to our own motion is giving us the illusion. We feel weightless. And that feeling is as much reality as our feeling of being bound to the Earth is a reality. We feel that because everything around us is moving, hurtling through the solar system at exactly the same speed, so we don't feel it as motion. And, you know, it feels like, for me, when people talk about Malick's naivety and, you know, him having these huge questions, it does him a disservice, because I feel that these big questions, A, are important, and B, he always seems to contextualize them in what it is actually to live life in the world right now, with these buildings around us and this traffic and those roads and that car that doesn't care that Holly is grieving.
I know.
You know. And I'll give you an example of this. You know, they faff around with a caterpillar at some point, which is what it's that endless play of just hanging around. What do you do with someone you love? You know, you can't have sex all the time, so you hang out, you know. But there's a bit where Faye is in a supermarket, and it's one of those where the butcher is behind transparent glass, and you can sort of see the butchering warehouse behind her, and she's looking at the meat. And it's on one level, it's Malick doing a very obvious metaphor, is she's seen inside the sausage factory of
Yes.
music and
And it
art.
ain't pretty.
Yeah, exactly. And now she's identifying herself maybe with the pieces of meat in the thing. But it also, to me, is a real counterpoint to the Malickian, the Malickian with a capital M in quote marks used in all the things. They'll always mention the wheat fields and the magic hour, and they'll never mention the butcher shop and the supermarket aisle.
And the suburban environs, or I mean, the spaces you move through in Song to Song, you've got the music festival first and foremost. You've got the various apartment spaces, from the little tiny bedsit, which I take to be Faye's actual sort of little flat, when her dad comes over, and how are you going? Have you got a job? Well, bits and pieces, to these other houses that she manages to, I don't know, dog sit for or look after or whatever. Those architectural spaces that Malick seems quite fascinated by, which is this sort of very contemporary, very kind of modern, but also depersonalized. I think of it as hotel aesthetic. Lots of glass, lots of generic furniture, lots of clean lines, very muted color scheme, nothing individuating.
A really high tech version of IKEA, not IKEA,
Absolutely.
the most expensive version of IKEA,
but soulless, de-individuated.
Yes.
Compare that with, there's a beautiful kitchen. Can't remember whose place this is. You see a couple of scenes with the sort of sheet metal kind of embossed in the splashback area. You've got little knickknacks. There's a little knickknack on one side of the guy cycling. There's little animals. There's little knickknacks. There's a sort of coziness, expressiveness, a kind of domestic space that's got some individuation, some personality, some kind of atmosphere. So there's this different, moving through different spaces with different qualities. The road, the gas station. How many important scenes? There's a very important scene with her father, almost like this sort of moment of existential crisis in a gas station, right? The most, generic American space that exists, utterly impersonal, yet ubiquitous, totally familiar, totally banal. And so this becomes a charged space,
To jump in there, but the breakup with BV and Faye seems to happen while he's wiping the windows of the Jeep in a gas station, and it's similar to Into the Wonder.
Right.
They break up going through a drive-through fast food place, and that's where she appears to tell Ben Affleck's character that she has cheated on him, essentially. She's sort of suicide by cop when it comes to a relationship. You were too weak to break up with me, so I slept with someone, and now it's over.
That's it. Yeah, exactly. And, I agree with you. There is this, overemphasis on the, touching of the wheat fields and golden hour and the sort of, dancing figures cavorting or, defying gravity. So that weightless theme. But there's always to me, there's this dimension of earth, of groundedness, of being in the world, if you want, that's so palpable in the literal sense in Malick. It's physical material. It's about place. It's about texture. It's about materiality. It's about the space, the atmosphere, the physicality. I mean, we talk a lot about nature in Malick. It's super important. But so many of his films are moving between these highly urbanized spaces, these interiors. There's a whole, and some wonderful studies actually been done, I think, on this aspect of his work. The creation of space, like spaces of dwelling, right, in the New World, right? The contrast between the sort of utterly barren and brutal sort of setting up of the colony of Jamestown versus the Powhatan sort of spaces, the meeting places and the huts and the smoke chimneys and the skylight sort of design and whatnot. The architectural spaces in Tree of Life, Jack as architect, etc. I mean, he's really fascinated by how we as human beings in the modern world inhabit space, our spaces of dwelling. Very Heideggerian kind of idea, but it's there, I think. And this really includes, the banal suburban sort of non-spaces that so many of us live in. So
and also like Kate Blanchett. Is it Blanchett or
yes.
Blanket? Blanchett.
Blanchett, yeah.
Yeah, she lives literally in a glass house. She's
It's incredible. Yes.
I mean, there's a bit where she sort of stands in the corner of two walls that are intersecting, but the
Yes.
walls are entirely glass.
That's
She's
right.
like in a glass cube, and you can see people.
Yeah.
And her, I mean, I read some reviews of this at the time it came out, and they were like, "Oh, it's property porn," you know. And it's just like you think you think Jack Fisk, the most sort of creative art designer in movies, is accidentally choosing these locations.
Yeah.
They don't
Yeah.
tell you anything about character. They don't tell you anything about the milieu. You just think they like shooting nice houses. When exactly what you said, Robert, these aren't necessarily nice houses. They're wealthy they're the
Yes.
houses of wealthy people, but there are different degrees of wealth. There's the nouveau riche. There's the splendid sort of slightly kitschy wealth that you see in some places. Banderas's house in Hollywood is this palatial sort of.
That's right. Yes.
Versailles.
Versace-like.
yeah, Versace/Versailles.
Same as Versace. Yeah. No, it's absolutely true, and I think what you say about the use of that space. This is why you can have minimal dialogue, and you can convey visually through the bodies in space. Like the number of scenes involving characters moving at odds with each other in these modern, architecturally very chic but soulless spaces, of houses that are clearly architecturally designed, very, very high end. But you don't need to have a lot of dialogue to show these bodies moving in ways that express a profound disconnection or alienation or disenchantment with each other. You see that a lot in Tree of Life, right, with Jack and his wife. It's clear. You don't even have to have a dialogue. You can just see them moving in that space, in that beautiful but utterly soulless apartment or house that they live in. Likewise in this film, in some of those sequences.
They look like nobody lives there.
Yeah.
They look, that's there's no detritus. There's no what Philip K. Dick would call kibble, or kipple, sorry, what's he called? Kipple in Do Androids Dream of Electric Street. The old magazines, the old copies of the New Yorker you mean to throw away.
Signs of life,
Yeah, precisely.
There's something deadening about them, and I think they become, for that reason, very symbolically charged, very affectively charged spaces. You can say a lot by showing the characters in those spaces without having them actually having to spell it out in dialogue, And I think that's, again, with Malick's work, it's very much about showing. And I guess as a film goer, you either kind of go with that, you get fascinated by the movements of the character. This is why the actors have to be physical and very physically expressive for it to work. And I think the actors he works with have got that amazing capacity to express an enormous amount through just little gestures, little actions, forms of touch. That's really significant in Malick's work. But even facial expressions, and the sort of interplay between the voiceover and what we're seeing the characters do in front of us, which sometimes mesh, at other times clash, and all sorts of configurations become possible there. But again, I think that's a really important part of Malick that doesn't get the attention it deserves. It's not just this sort of flowing, communing with nature kind of dimension. There is a strong emphasis on groundedness and belonging to the earth, being grounded. And I think that's where Faye and Vivi end up as a couple, And at the same time, this desire for transcendence, this desire to go beyond, to be free, as they keep saying. But it turns out that freedom wasn't quite what they thought, or love, and freedom through love, through erotic love, but love in all sorts of senses, wasn't quite what they imagined it. And I think Faye says as much at one point. It's not quite what they expected. But I think it's both those elements working together, the sort of desire for transcendence and this kind of like, think of those camera movements just sweeping across the surface of the ground, literally, showing, look, in the end, we're grounded, we're earthed. This is where we exist, this is where we belong, while we also have this desire to go beyond and to be transcendent, to fly, to go beyond where we're at.
We're coming towards the end of our conversation, so there's a couple of things that I feel we might want to discuss before we close off. First of all, I this has a lot of music in it,
Yes.
a lot of popular music, but a lot of also sort of contemporary classical music. I think
Yes.
Malick is definitely that sort of carrying on Kubrick's, what Kubrick did in
Absolutely.
2001 and promoting
Yes.
20th and 21st century composers, introducing them to the repertoire, so to speak.
Yes.
And here we have also people like Val Kilmer, Iggy Pop,
Mm.
uh, Johnny Rotten or John Lydon, the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Licky Lee, who's
Yes.
a musician in her own right and has a really lovely, convincing sort of cameo as a sort of
Mm.
ex-girlfriend of BV's, uh, and sort of grounds BV as a musical character.
Yeah.
So you have, and I also think Cook is very good, or Michael Fassbender is very good
Yes.
as a backstage. He's exactly who you would meet backstage, and he's him roughhousing it with the lads and.
Oh, yeah. Totally believable.
Yeah, absolutely. He's not going to stand on ceremony with these guys.
No.
That would give them too much power. He's a
Yeah.
guy who knows a guy.
Yes. Yeah,
And
exactly.
even the guy who he buys drugs off, who can stick scissors in his nose and stuff.
Yes. The Green Man.
Eric Sprague, who himself is a performance artist. So, yeah, it's remarkable how Malick has got these. How the
Yes.
hell does he
Incredible.
even know
Yeah.
about these people? Let alone. So I think there's that aspect of it that we haven't touched on too much, but is it something you want to?
Look, I mean, we could have a whole discussion. There would be a wonderful podcast just exploring music. I cannot think of a filmmaker. I mean, there are filmmakers who are deeply, deeply musically attuned in their filmmaking practice in different ways. I think of Lynch this way. I think of Terrence Malick in this way. Tarantino in a different way. Kubrick, perhaps. Above all, who really, to my mind, approach filmmaking as an art form that shares a profound affinity with music. I know that, say, in film theory and film studies, for a long time, people talked about, film and literature, film and theater, and so on. But to me, the art form it probably shares most with in different ways is music and musical structuring, musical motifs, counterpoint, harmony, dissonance. It's just all there. And filmmakers who, like Malick, I think, think musically. There's a really nice moment where Fassbender, in his little Vox Pop interview on the CD, talks about how profoundly Malick understands music. And music of all sorts. You've got we mentioned, rolling and tumbling. There's like about 3-4 different versions from the older Elmore, I can't remember, Elmore James or whoever, right through the Bob Dylan version and another version of this, classic Delta blues tune. You've got all of those contemporary composers that Malick has used in different contexts, say in Tree of Life. Some of the classics, you've got Mahler in there, you've got Saint-Saëns, you've got Debussy, you've got all the sort of romantic and classic composers in there. And you've got this incredible array of performers and really interesting choices too. I think I was looking actually just before our talk here at a wonderful compilation of the soundtrack. Some wonderful YouTuber has gone through and managed to assemble not quite a full list, but pretty close to a playlist of YouTube clips of the various musical songs and sources that are used in Song to Song. Absolutely extraordinary, worth spending some time with, because you really develop an appreciation. I always try and scroll through the credits and then on IMDb to see what the sources were for the music and where Malick has cut between different musical sources, because so much of the texture, not just the texture, but the meaning of scenes, I think, is carried by musical choices, and obviously, when you're watching, you just are going with the mood and the atmosphere and the emotional sort of tenor of the music. This incredible dynamism of the Austin kind of music festival scenes, then interspersed with very different kind of mood created by other musical styles that are sort of juxtaposed and woven together. But that's an essential part, I think, of his filmmaking practice. I think the selection and choice of music and the way image and sound and musical form are kind of working together in his work is really extraordinary. Because again, there's that emphasis on movements and choreography and dance-like kind of dynamics between the bodies, the characters in the film. But this is so tied in with the use of sound and use of music. And of course, it's not just music, it's sound and soundscaping. I mean, again, you only have to listen to the film with headphones on and you appreciate how much the underscore is, bird song and ambient sounds of the urban scape of voices, of, the ambience of the festival and conversations in nightclubs and all sorts of things that again, create that rich sense of a world that we can become immersed in. So for me, that's one of the great art achievements in Malick's work, is how to use music with cinema, with image, in ways that creates something that's much greater than the sum of its parts, something that's really deeply expressive and powerful and moving.
Yeah, and it has that sort of, it uses silence and darkness as well to sort of, almost like tracks. This is ending, and then another vignette begins with a different oral soundscape and a different, it's remarkable in that sense. You're sort of getting a visual overload and an aural overload, and then it goes down to silence and darkness, and then it comes back up again.
That's it. There's all sorts of dynamics at play. Absolutely.
The other thing I wanted to mention, and I wanted to get your reaction to this, because I think it's I was talking to someone, and they actually sent me they were basically sent a very early version of Song to Song, an early cut, by the makers, and they were asked for notes. They were said, like, Mr. Malick has enjoyed your work and would appreciate your input on what you think of this film. And so he was able to send me the notes, and thereby I got a chance to sort of look at what a possible earlier version of Song to Song would look like, and accompanied with his sort of memories of it, which were more precise. And he told of a far more conventional film, which played out with proper scenes, more dialogue, looked more like, although wasn't scripted necessarily, but looked more like a scripted film. Was much more experiential and experimental. There has always been a talk of To the Wonder, especially existing in different versions, that he has talked about wanting to go back and potentially release. Even, who was saying to me, somebody mentioned, okay, so this is on the level of, I'm not going to cite any sources here because this is on the level of that there was even talk of a possibility of Way of the Wind being maybe coming out in different formats.
Right. Okay.
And I do sometimes wonder if this is sort of partly to do with long post-production, that you just end up in, you're not spending 2 years, 4 years, 5 years cutting one film.
Just on the one version, there must
you're
be
doing
multiple
it,
versions,
cutting 5 or 6 versions, and then saying, okay, I think this is the one we're going to go for. I mean, and in the case of the New World, that obviously actually did lead to there being 3 or 4 versions available. Tree of Life, there are 2 versions that are available. So I kind of wanted...
Voyage of Time as well.
Voyage of Time was made as sort of 2 separate films. You know, Voyage of Time IMAX, an IMAX experience, and Voyage of Time with Kate Blanchett and Brad Pitt offering different voiceovers. Really different films, 90 minutes and 60 minutes, different duration, everything. So my question is kind of, given that a sort of more conventional film was available, do you feel, I feel a bit awkward second guessing Terrence Malick, but do you feel like, he should have gone in a more conventional direction, or do you feel, there's a bit of me that feels like this is almost like a B-side And I don't mean
Yeah.
that as a bad thing, because
No, no,
some of
no.
my favorite
B-sides can be
songs,
great. Yes,
exactly,
indeed.
exactly.
Indeed.
But it's kind of
They
where
have
you
their
would put,
place.
exactly, it's where you put the
Yeah.
instrumental version or
Yeah.
the acoustic version.
That's a really apt metaphor. Yeah.
Yeah.
For this film. No, look, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I personally have really developed an appreciation for this film. But as we talked about earlier, there's no doubt this one bombed. It was really disliked by many, many, even Malick fans, like Malick devotees, and there are many of them out there who struggled with this film. And in bits that I wrote about this film, I was really exercised by this. And I do think the decision to strip narrative form back to this very elemental level, to strip characterization back to this very elusive, fleeting, and fragmentary kind of style. You know, these personages rather than fully fleshed characters. To play around with chronology, to minimize dialogue to such a degree, and substitute little bits of narration in voiceover, little bits of reflection, and allow the visuals and the movement and the music and so on to carry the film. All very daring and bold and brilliant. But clearly there's a cost. And the cost is that there's sort of narrative satisfactions that I think a lot of moviegoers, including many Malick fans, were after. The balance was not as finely observed as, for example, in Tree of Life, which is magnificent, I think, in part because it manages to be both a really compelling narrative film in quite a straightforward sense, and this extraordinary meditation on life and the universe and everything with so much visual brilliance and experimental kind of grandeur, and yet has that incredibly powerful emotional core which really carried the film. So I think even post this film, Malick himself, you would know this much better, did remark that he thought perhaps we did go a bit far with narrative abstraction. In the next film, I think he was referring to what then was called Radegund. I think then, Hidden Life was the title. We're going back to a bit more of a conventional kind of narrative style. And I mean, I can see that, it was an experiment that is admirable for being so bold and so outrageous, to use Hollywood stars in a kind of very sort of explicitly neo new wave style of movie, with a lot of, if one cares to delve into it, philosophical and maybe even spiritual heft, as well as the, we talked about the eroticism and the, other aspects. But I mean, as a narrative work, it's hard work. It's much more of a poetic exploration of these characters and their world. And I think that Malick's decision, certainly with Hidden Life, which I think has got a lot more of that narrative drive and, more conventional sort of scene setting and characterization and so on, was possibly a result of, the reception or the, pretty poor reception of particularly Song to Song, and yet, like watching it now with a few years distance, I think, there is much there that is incredibly rich. And, we spent, I don't know how long talking about it, and there's more to say. There are a lot of riches there, but it is demanding, and I think, to me, that's that balance that a filmmaker like Malick has always managed to explore so creatively and so beautifully between narrative abstraction and kind of narrative, convention, finding ways of pushing conventional movie making into really new areas of stylistic experimentation and so on, while having a really signature kind of approach or style. But it is a fine balance, and you need to have characters that people care enough about in order to stick with their journey and, ultimately have the satisfaction and payoff of, seeing where it all ends up. And I think that perhaps is where Song to Song really did struggle to connect with audience in some cases. And having said that, though, I still want to defend it in many ways, because I think as a poetic and experimental work, it's just remarkable and should be recognized.
Absolutely, a Criterion box set awaits.
You bet.
Know,
Absolutely.
wouldn't that be wonderful? And I mean, yeah, I think it's ripe for rediscovery. It reminds me, your comments remind me of Martin Amis writing about James Joyce and saying of Finnegan's Wake, it was a great experiment, but it turns out we do need a story. It's
In a nutshell, yeah,
yeah,
that's
yeah.
it.
I've really enjoyed rewatching the film. It's definitely gained by multiple viewings, even though,
Yes.
if you're Pauline Kael, you never watch a film more than once. But this one really, really does gain in
Oh, I agree.
and also through conversation. So thank you so much,
Yes.
Robert, for joining me and going into song to song at such depth, and it's been really a rich conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Yes. Look, thank you very much, John. I've really enjoyed it too. And maybe talk more about Malick in the future.
Thank you.